Always fun, the different troubles we've got. All right, we are live. Outstanding. Well, thanks so much. I'm actually just corresponding with Alex Johnson, one of our interns at the NATO Association. And so now we are live. I'm happy to welcome you to a discussion on the COVID implications to the global situation with three fantastic authors and a wonderful moderator for us today. My name is Robert Baines. I am the president and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada, and it's our pleasure to host you today. The NATO Association of Canada is a charitable nonprofit. Our whole mandate is to make sure that Canadians understand the value of security and the importance of NATO. As you'd appreciate, that's something that most Canadians don't usually have to think about. And so it's our job to just poke every once in a while, always suggesting new discussions, new points to bring Canadians out of their everyday lives into the realm of global affairs. It is something that's extremely valuable and very important for us to be doing now more. And with that, I would like to just give a bit of an understanding of what we're going to be doing for the rest of this hour. I'm going to be introducing you to Dr. Jennifer Orange, our fabulous moderator, and I'll be pleased to have your inclusion as far as questions are concerned as well. If you do take a look at your right of your screen, if you are tuning in through YouTube Live, you'll see there is a little space for asking questions. Hopefully we'll be able to manage that a little later in the event. But today we are going to hear from three fabulous authors who have just published some interesting pieces of note. First of all, I should mention our intrepid Dr. Tina Park is one of our vice presidents at the NATO Association. She'll be talking about a chapter she's recently published. Dr. Adam Chapnick, who's been a guest of ours several times in the past, the Royal Military College and the Canadian Forces College, and Dr. Thomas Axworthy, who's been with Massey quite some time. That's Massey College. He is chair of public policy there, and obviously somebody who's been involved in discussions about politics and international relations for most of his career. With that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Jennifer Orange. Jennifer, we've had the pleasure to be associated on many occasions. This is our first event together, and it's my absolute pleasure to be able to work with you. And with that, over to you.
Thank you so much, Robert. I am thrilled to be participating today, and thank you for the invitation. And thank you to everyone who is joining us online. One of the advantages of doing these virtual events is that we can include people from coast to coast to coast, and we are glad to have you all today. As we begin, I would like to turn our minds to the land on which each of us is working today. As I am situated in Toronto and based at the Graham Centre at the University of Toronto, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the university operates, but I invite you to be mindful of the land wherever you are. For thousands of years, the land at the university has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. To begin today, we will ask each of our guests to speak for up to 5 minutes about their book. We will then use the balance of the time to answer your questions. So you may enter your questions in the chat function, and we will do our best to get through as many as possible. I'm now going to hand the floor over to Adam Chapnick.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. So my book on the history of Canada on the United Nations Security Council really sees the story of Canada on the Council through 4 stages. The early years, modernization, professionalization, and the stage we're in today, which is politicization. So I'll just give you a couple of words on each one. The early years were the establishment of the UN Security Council. Some will know that Canada had no interest in serving on the council when it was established. Our name was put forward reluctantly, and we lost in the first election to Australia by fluke when one of the voters from one of the Latin American countries accidentally signed his ballot, invalidating it and preventing us from getting the 2/3 support we needed to acquire a seat in the second round of voting. The Australians pulled ahead of us and stayed ahead of us, and we gave up. We did reluctantly put our name forward for the term that succeeded Australia, because we felt that if we didn't, it would be a vote of non-confidence in the UN. We didn't want to do that. So we served somewhat reluctantly there. And then again, 10 years later, in the 1957 election for the 58-59 term, it took us until the very last minute to decide to go forward, in large part because the Liberal government that had been in power up till 1957 under Louis Saint-Laurent really wasn't interested. And again, the thinking was, if the UN isn't working, we can contribute in better ways than sitting on the Security Council for a couple of years. However, if we don't sit and we send a message to the rest of the world that we've given up, that would be bad as well. So reluctantly, we came on. The second period of modernization, is when the council expands itself from 11 to 15 members and when the Canadian attitude begins to change. So the 1960s, once more, we have to basically be begged to put our name forward. We do put our name forward at the last second, and we are acclaimed and serve our 2 years. Then following that, in the 1970s, under Pierre Trudeau, Mr. Trudeau decided that he wanted to know if it was actually a good idea or not to serve on the council, and he had a full-fledged government review of the benefits and drawbacks, where he did conclude that it was in Canada's interest to serve. We put our name forward and were acclaimed in an election where there were 2 candidates for 2 seats. The third phase, professionalization, is really about when we started to have to campaign. And so in the 1980s, our name was put forward by the Trudeau government before they were defeated. The Mulroney government inherited what was thought to be an uncontested bid. And then all of a sudden, the Greeks decided they wanted to contest one of these seats as well. We put forward what I believe to be the most sophisticated campaign to that point in UN history. It was also the most successful contested campaign in Western European and Others Group history, where we were elected with more than 80% of the vote. Went on to serve a very important term that no one really knew about because all of our work was behind the scenes. 10 years later, flash forward, Canada puts its name forward again. And once again, the Greeks jump back in, cause a contested election. Again, we run a very good campaign and are elected again and have our most activist term on the council. Since then, things haven't been so smooth. The era I believe we're in now is I call politicization. The Liberals put in for a bid for 2010. The Conservatives inherited it. It looked like it would be fine, and then the Germans jumped in. The election did not go nearly as well. The Portuguese ran a tremendous campaign. The Germans basically bullied their way through, and we were left in the dust. It was not a whole of Canada. It became a partisan issue. And regrettably, when Mr. Trudeau Jr. was elected, the younger was elected, it continued to be a partisan issue. Our name was put forward under the guise of Canada being back. And this time it was Canada that intervened in an election that was already contested. And as many of you will know from last week, the results there weren't very good either. So we are in an era where things are politicized. That is a shame. It hasn't always been that way. Hopefully it won't be at some point in the future.
Thank you so much, Adam. And I must note that this is one of the rare experiences where all of our speakers so far are meeting their time limits. So thank you. And Tom, before I pass it over to Tina, we're trying to troubleshoot a bit with your sound issue. And we're wondering if you can turn the volume down a bit on your computer, and we'll see if that helps us when you next speak. Thank you. For now, I'd like to pass it over to Tina Park. Oh, you're still muted, Tina.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I will ask Robert if we could share my screen, or if he could load up my PowerPoint slides so we could go through it together.
Yeah, Tina, you should be able to share it there at the bottom of your screen.
Great, thank you. Could everybody see it okay?
Yeah, we're good to go.
Thanks, everyone. Today, I'd like to speak to you about a book chapter I have done in partnership with Michael Switzer, a colleague of mine from the Canadian Centre for the Responsibility to Protect. And this is part of a series published by SciCon, which is a NATO Centre for Excellence based in Estonia. And our chapter is called R2P and Cyberspace, Sovereignty as a Responsibility. So what is R2P? R2P, as many of you know, is a humanitarian principle coined in 2001 and later adopted by 150 countries at the 2005 UN World Summit. Essentially, it says when sovereign states are unable or unwilling to fulfill their responsibility to protect their own populations from mass atrocity crimes, the international community has a responsibility to do so. So R2P was really brought about by the failed humanitarian intervention we saw in the 1990s. And there were controversies when intervention took place, as in Somalia, Bosnia, and Kosovo, or when it failed to take place, as in Rwanda. And R2P is a very important conceptual and normative shift from the Westphalian notion of absolute sovereignty to sovereignty as responsibility. And today, when we speak of R2P, it's restricted to genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. And since then, the UN has been at the forefront of looking at ways to implement R2P, and the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, since 2009, has been publishing a report on how we could adopt it at the national, regional, and international levels. R2P has 3 pillars: the state's responsibility to protect populations and assisting states in that capacity building, and the international community's responsibility to support and use appropriate tools when necessary. We know that, for instance, in Kenya, the R2P principle was very successfully used by Kofi Annan through private sector intervention, and it was often seen as a success story. But we also know of some of the failed cases like Libya, where R2P was explicitly used, but because of the regime change that followed after, it became very criticized for selective nature of intervention. And when we look at what's happening in Syria, more than 500,000 people have been killed and over 11.8 million people have been made refugees or internally displaced people. And this is largely due to the deadlock we're seeing at the UN Security Council. And we're also very much aware of unintended consequences of intervention, as we saw with Libya. And in Syria, we continue to see crimes against humanity being committed and all sorts of violations on international humanitarian law, human rights law, and international criminal law. So where are we today with R2P? We are seeing a bit of a deadlock on Syria and other cases. And the focus today on R2P is on early warning prevention and using technology. And we know that mass atrocity crimes do not really happen overnight. So various capabilities and capacities could be built well in advance for both prevention and response. So the critical question that we asked with our chapter was, how can we use technology to prevent and respond to R2P crimes? And in particular, we focused on 3 key effects, so cyber material sabotage, cyber information collection and manipulation, as well as cyber social influence. And to just go through it quickly, there are challenges when, for instance, you see hackers using platform online to engage in theft, which then bolsters financial capabilities for actors committing atrocity crimes. And we see that a lot with North Korean hackers, for instance. And although we can't really act against nation states on these issues, we could use certain capabilities to disrupt the activities of non-state actors committing mass atrocity crimes. There are also issues of surveillance capabilities, which allows actors to track and target particular populations. And the use of censorship, for instance, in China is a very serious challenge. On that, we can ask for greater state accountability as well as civil society reporting to ensure that we are fully aware of what is happening with information online. Lastly, there's issue of social influence in platforms like Facebook, which is used to recruit for the purposes of committing mass atrocity crimes and inciting hate towards a particular group. And on that, we can ask for more from actors like Facebook to censor hate speech and also use that platform to counter hate influence. In conclusion, we have advocated for mainstreaming cyber domain in the R2P discourse and investing in public-private partnership and using AI technology for innovative solutions. So I will leave it at that, and I will look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina, and thank you to each of our presenters. That was a wonderful way to get the conversation started. And while I give you a moment to add your questions for our speakers to the chat, I'm going to start off the conversation with a question of my own. I learned so much from reading each of your works, and so I encourage everyone to pick up the pieces if they haven't already. But one thing that struck me is that all three of you touch on the issue of public opinion. I mean, Tom clearly writes about it most directly, but Adam frequently references the influence of Canadian opinion regarding the UN during any of Canada's election campaigns to the Security Council. And Tina, as you just mentioned, writes about the challenges of cyber social influence. So I wanted to start with Adam and ask Adam, how important was Canadian public opinion to Canada's performance in the recent Security Council election?
Very good question. Thank you, Jennifer. I think you can look at this in two different ways. At one level, it made no difference whatsoever. This was a campaign where the 193 countries voted, and 192 of them weren't paying very close attention to what was going on in Canada directly, and so public opinion here wouldn't have mattered. On the other hand, the government of the day very much wanted the public to care about this election until closer to the end, by framing it in this language of Canada is back and treating it, at least at first, as a litmus test for whether the foreign policy of the current government was tangibly different and measurably more effective than the foreign policy of the previous government. So this government made foreign policy, made public opinion an issue, even if it wasn't outside of the country nearly as much.
Tina or Tom, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. When it comes to R2P crimes and prevention, public opinion matters a great deal in influencing political will to take action. So we've seen, for instance, in working with parliamentarians that even if it's unclear who should be taking action for prevention or response to a mass atrocity crime, if there is a very strong consensus from the public for engagement, often that leads to greater engagement from the government itself. So as we look at cyber capabilities and different things that individuals could do to prevent and respond to mass atrocity crimes, public opinion figures very prominently in that discussion. And the power that everybody holds in their mobile phones and devices is really incredible because just 20 years ago, to be able to videograph something that happens in front of you in real time and then post it on something like Twitter or YouTube would have been unthinkable. But today, everybody has that power to call out when there is an abuse or violation or some sort of crisis in front of them. And that really expands our capacity to act in a timely manner.
Sure, thank you. And Tom?
Jennifer, the sound.
That is better, thank you.
That better?
Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for working through that.
Okay, so my specific focus in my contribution to the volume was all about public opinion.
Yes.
And here we've got almost a bit of a disconnect, which is by surveys and public opinion, by vast percentages, Canadians are in favor of a northern foreign policy, a more active northern defense policy, more infrastructure spending in the Arctic, and so on. But while there is a huge consensus that these are good things to do, they very rarely have been done. So if one looks at the recent reports of the Senate and the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee on the Arctic, they are litanies of past promises made to the Arctic with very little follow through in any major kind of way. So though public opinion is important, there are not many seats, only 3 in terms of the political calculations. And the decision makers have found it easy to ignore where the public wants to go in terms of the Arctic in favor of other priorities. It's never easy in government. There's always competing demands, but there's been very little political backup to the overwhelming public consensus that we see that we need a more active Arctic policy. Public opinion has not been enough.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I can now turn to questions from our audience. So the first one is for Tina. So Tina, can national laws regulate cyberspace, or does it necessitate an international approach? You're muted, Tina, sorry.
Sorry. I think it really depends on the national context, because if you look at some of the platforms, even Zoom that we're using right now, Zoom has different policies for the US market versus the Chinese market. So when it comes to regulating what happens online, the cooperation between national governments and private sector actors are absolutely critical. And I think it's not even just national. Depending on the region, you may have different regulations on privacy issues. So, you know, it's a different example, but even on contact tracing apps in the midst of COVID pandemic in Canada, it gets much more complicated compared to a country like Korea, because different provinces have different regulations and different levels of comfort. So no, there is no clear blueprint on how we navigate through the cybersecurity issue and privacy concerns. But what we could do is to ask for more clarity and transparency from all actors involved.
Thank you so much. And Tom, now that we have your audio much clearer, I wanted to ask you a question from the audience, but then maybe ask you to spend a couple moments just talking about your book. The question is, increased passability in the Arctic waters will inevitably increase international diplomatic tension. Are there any signals that more resources will be mobilized towards a more robust military presence in the area as a method of deterrence?
Well, there are two large areas when we talk about capabilities. And the questioner is right, obviously, that with the melting of the ice, one reason that there is so much more attention to the Northwest Passage and the Northeastern Passage of Russia is that if the ice melts and it opens up, it takes about 20 days off of a transit from China. So that's an important transportation fact. And in fact, the US Secretary of State said that for the 21st century, the Northwest Passage and the Arctic may become like the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal. Perhaps a bit exaggerated, but it shows the point that geopolitical planners are looking at. But when we look at Canadian capabilities, there are two which are really critical. And the first is icebreakers. I mean, you cannot have an intelligent policy around the Northwest without having the ability to transit and to help the many months of the year when ice is critical, and even in the summer it's very difficult. And yet in Canada, as one more indication that we mostly have an Arctic policy in an absence of mind, the Mulroney government promised a major icebreaker that was deferred. The Justin Trudeau government has talked about a icebreaker. We still haven't even let the contract yet. So there's much doubt. Russia has 40 of them. China is building it now, a nuclear icebreaker, and Canada hasn't even let a contract go for a heavy icebreaker. The Louis Saint Laurent is now 50 years old. So our capacity in the Coast Guard and icebreakers, if we're going to take advantage of these tremendous issues that are occurring around the passages, is quite negligible at the moment. And then just lastly, we have had originally the DEW line and then the Northern Defense Warning System in terms of possible incursion from Russia. Well, the Northern system is now just about also losing its effectiveness. It will cost billions to replace that system. And my last examination showed nowhere do I see an allocation for replacement of the Northern Defense Warning System. So we have a real capability gap when it comes to talking about the Arctic in the future.
Thank you so much for that explanation. Our next question from the audience is for Adam, and it's a question that many of us have been asking ourselves over the past week or so. What do you think are the reasons why Canada lost its bid for the Security Council this year?
So it's a great question. I have to say, until the confidential data is released, which is 30 years from now, we can't be certain, but I would suggest that the number one reason Canada wasn't successful was that we joined a campaign against two very legitimate countries a decade late. In other words, Ireland announced its bid in 2005, and Norway announced its bid in 2007. We announced our bid in 2016. Between 2005 or 2007 and 2016, Ireland and Norway secured a whole bunch of commitments from other countries to vote with them through vote swaps and other negotiations, which meant that by the time we joined the race, we were starting from behind against two UN darlings. And no matter how good our campaign was going to be, it would have been extremely difficult to overtake these two countries. And while our campaign picked things up in the last 6 months, that I don't think was enough to defeat these particular countries in this case.
Thank you, Adam. We have a follow-up question for Tom. How does China's claim to the Arctic as a near Arctic state complicate these international diplomatic tensions over the region?
Well, certainly complicates it for the Americans and probably everybody else. China has a very well enunciated Arctic policy, but 2018, where it calls itself a near Arctic state. Now, it's 900 miles away from the Arctic, but great powers like to put themselves in the higher stratospheres. So China is a near Arctic state, it says. We should also understand that probably China today may be the leading promoter and investor in Arctic research. They have an enormous Arctic research capacity. And as I talked about, there is great interest in securing those shipping routes. In their white paper, a substantial portion was devoted to the shipping route issue. And we know that Chinese investors have been very interested in Greenland. They've been very interested in Iceland. We just had a Chinese bid to take over a Canadian gold mine. I think they already have a zinc or nickel mine in northern Quebec. So, and building a nuclear icebreaker, of which only Russia has nuclear icebreakers, that's a very great indication that China intends to be a major Arctic player. And as the world's second or first economy with a huge interest in environmental issues, China wants to be at the table when these rules and regulations are written. So we now have an even more important game, and that is that China is a growing power, but it has a great interest in the Arctic. And indeed, when it talks about its Belt and Road program, it has actually talked about a polar Silk Road. So the Chinese are on their way.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is for Tina. Tina, and this is interesting, is cyberspace helpful in an R2P context in countries that impose heavy government censorship of the internet?
Sure. An example that comes to my mind is North Korea, for instance, where it remains largely disconnected from the rest of the world. And there is very heavy government censorship on all its citizens, not just in cyberspace, frankly, but in all aspects of life. Yet we are aware of millions of people in North Korea who are in prison camps because of their political beliefs, as well as the prevalence of North Korean hackers who often operate outside of North Korea to generate billions of dollars of revenue, which then they use to develop nuclear weapons and other weapons that really threaten international security. So in the context of North Korea, yes, it's absolutely linked. The fact that its citizens are not connected to the outside world has a lot to do with the fact that the regime is interested in oppressing the population, and the regime continues to commit crimes against humanity. And it's been well documented by UN Commission of Inquiry headed by Justice Michael Kirby that crimes that are far worse than those committed by the Nazis are currently taking place in North Korea. And yet the North Korean people themselves do not have the actual platform or ability to communicate what's happening with the rest of the world. So yes, absolutely, this is just one example of many ways in which there's a very strong correlation between cyber capabilities and R2P mass atrocity crimes.
Thank you for that answer. Adam, here's a question for you. In light of its loss at the Security Council recently, should Canada engage in a review of its foreign policy?
It's a question that makes me grin because I just blogged about this today. I don't think it is the right time for a foreign policy review for two primary reasons. Reason number one is, in a minority government, we don't have a good record of successful foreign policy reviews. Joe Clark tried one in 1979. He didn't even finish it by the time his government fell from power. And then it wasn't picked up by the Trudeau government in the same way. Paul Martin tried one in 2005. He got his published, and then it was ignored by the Conservative government that followed within half a year. So one reason is minority governments just aren't stable enough to justify foreign policy reviews, especially when we're in a politicized situation where the opposition is going to discount what the findings. The other reason is that the United States is critical to Canadian foreign policy, and the Americans are so close to an election right now that I don't think it makes sense to try to figure out what the next few years of Canadian foreign policy are going to look like until we know who is in the White House and who controls the Senate in the United States. So even if we did have a stable government for a number of years, I'd prefer to wait till November to even start thinking about these things in detail.
Thank you very much. Our next question is for Tom. Tom, do you think developments in the Arctic could have any impact on the Inuit and other Indigenous residents of the Arctic?
Oh yes, one of the main theses of the book we've just written is that the Inuit and northern residents have an overwhelming interest and contribution to make on an active Arctic policy. That I would actually go so far to recommend that the next time that Canada becomes chair of the Arctic Council, we should have a de facto co-chair with the permanent participants, the Indigenous permanent participants who are on the council. That this is, if we look at the third dimension that I talked about, that security is beyond military and issues and diplomacy. How one lives and how one thrives and how one can have a fair life is crucial for northern residents and the Inuit First Nations there in particular. On one of our major issues, as I said, the Northwest Passage, the fact that we have had Native peoples living there since time immemorial is probably our single strongest factor in maintaining those vast expanses for future generations of Canadians. So we broke some new ground in Canada in 1996 by arguing for the idea of Indigenous representation on the Arctic Council, and this helped set a very useful precedent ultimately for the UN and the Indigenous Rights Declaration. We should make more use of that, and more generally, make that a core principle that when we look at Arctic policy, we do it in co-development and in partnership with the people who live there.
Well, that makes good sense. Thank you so much. Tina, the next question is for you. Can you discuss innovative solutions such as the use of AI in an R2P context? while taking into consideration the potential bad actors in cyberspace posing misinformation or fake news?
Thank you for that question. That's actually a very practical question. We recognize that we are in the midst of AI revolution, which really affects all aspects of society. And how does that then translate to R2P crimes and potential perpetrators of R2P crimes? And here it's important to note that it may not be a state, but non-state terror group, for instance, that's intent on using cyber tools for misinformation, for instance, as a part of campaign to disrupt a society or particular population. In that context, we also have to remember that just as these actors are using tools, technological tools to commit crimes and to recruit new actors and work on their goals, we also have technological tools at our disposal to counter such efforts. And this is why I think education is very important. And it's also important to work very closely with private sector agencies and actors who have the means to stop, for instance, Facebook ads, recruiting a particular group of people or targeting a particular group of people, or a campaign on Twitter, which could be easily stopped. And we have to remember back when the Rwandan genocide was taking place, the primary method of communication for perpetrators of crime was radio. And we did have the capacity at the time to shut down the radio network. And the same could be said about Twitter networks and Facebook ads and various activities that happen in the cyberspace. That NATO recognizes cyber domain as one of the domains for warfare today. And if we are very certain about the activities of these perpetrators, then we have to step up our game as well and say, okay, well, at the national level or international level, or even at individual levels, we have at our disposal so many tools that could be employed to detect risk factors well in advance before they break out, and to shut down and stop activities when they do take place. So I think we've reached a point in history where we can no longer say we didn't know about it, because nowadays everything could be tracked and everything is so public. So I'm actually more hopeful that with AI technology that we would be faster in detecting certain risk factors in certain crises, and that we would have more tools and resources to stop these perpetrators in a timely fashion.
Thank you so much. The next question from our audience is for Tom. Tom, what is the status on the legal case under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to affirm Canada's sovereignty to the waterways?
Well, this has been an ongoing process, and just relatively recently, just a few months ago, Canada actually we finally submitted our claim that goes to the law of the sea. So has Russia, which was the first, and Denmark and Greenland. So we actually now have those claims for the economic zone before that UN body. So that body will examine the claims and look at the science and data behind it. But I think there's a misconception that the UN will decide competing claims. They look at the validity of the science and make a judgment. But if we have a competing claim with Denmark or Russia, we have to negotiate that claim. That is, the law of the sea does not preclude the bargaining that will have to occur around those sets of issues. So we have in Canada, as well as all the other issues in the Arctic that I talked about, we have before us also the fact that we have a disputed territorial claim with the United States in the Beaufort area. That has to be settled. Negotiations began in the Obama administration. Of course, it's impossible with the Trump administration. We have an issue which is being examined by a task force now on Hans Island with Denmark. But having completed our submissions, we've got time because the UN never moves quickly on anything. But eventually Canada is going to have to negotiate and strike a deal with our partners. That's not impossible. Norway struck a deal with Russia in the Barents Sea, a set of negotiations. So it can be done. But it does mean that in terms of our resources in global affairs, our negotiators, and the backup to our case, which is why I'm continually arguing for more Arctic infrastructure involving our First Nations and the Inuit and those set of activities. We have really intense negotiations coming up on a critical set of issues. So we've got to really up our game if we have any chance of coming out of that with a good settlement.
Thank you very much. The next question from the audience is for Adam. Adam, based on the antagonizing push for inward protectionism and isolationism by President Trump, who can or will replace the instrumental role that the US plays in the international order should Mr. Trump embark on a withdrawal from NATO?
So I think that, I mean, that's a scary question, but I think, and a lot of it will depend on the results of the election in November, because I think my theory on the international order is that it is resilient enough to withstand 4 years of anything, but I'm not quite as confident on its ability to survive 8 years of challenges to it. And what I think this US administration doesn't seem to understand is that when the international order was set up, the fix was in favor of the West. We set up a system that privileged us over everyone else. And so undermining this system runs counter to our own interests. I don't see an obvious backup plan for an American withdrawal because the fix was in, and the fix assumed that the Americans would continue to hold this system up because it was in their interest to do so. I do see coalitions, the Germans, the French, the Canadians, and others trying to work together to resuscitate multilateralism, but I'm not sure we have the heft to do so in the face of challenges from China and Russia without the Americans. The advantage we have is that the default privileges the West, and so preserving what we have to me seems to be critical going forward.
Thank you very much. Tina, the next audience question is for you, and this is a practical question. It's a good one. How could cyberspace mechanisms be used effectively to prevent or protect populations from mass atrocities?
It's a loaded question, actually, and I thank you for that question. There are different things that different actors could do, and there's no easy solution for tackling mass atrocity crimes, because often the preventative measures that could be undertaken, there's no political pressure before a crisis actually breaks out for people to take action. And that includes, at the national level, regional level, unless there's an imminent crisis that is very visible. Often we don't see a strong political will to intervene and to act upon it. That said, when it comes to the cyber domain and detecting R2P crimes and responding to it, we know that the nature of warfare today is changing rapidly. And we also know that the types of crises that we're seeing are also changing. So to give you an example, what we found with the Myanmar case, for instance, Facebook was used to target particular groups of people in Myanmar. And in that particular case, we know that it was really just an issue of collaborating with Facebook, a private sector agency, to shut down those messages inciting hate and promoting certain groups of people to act upon and target a particular group of population. So yes, it's a very ambitious task to look at various activities and developments happening in the cyberspace and to see, where does R2P fit in, because we're already dealing with the issue of AI revolution and ethical and privacy implications of technological change. And in the midst of all of those efforts, we do have to remember the most vulnerable population. Think of, for instance, Syrian refugees who barely have access to internet from their refugee camps, yet their data and their access to information is being affected on a day-to-day basis because they're more vulnerable than others. In that particular case, it could be as easy as giving them tools to have a platform in which they could voice concerns and bring attention to some of the atrocities that are being committed, whether it is, violence against women or targeted bombing in certain parts of the world. We know that with modern technology and with the connected nature of cyberspace, it is much easier to call out these crimes and to bring attention and really become journalists just by using our mobile devices. So I do remain much more hopeful in terms of the tools that we have in the cyber domain and with technology when it comes to our ability to detect crimes from early stage and to coordinate our efforts, because often coordination is a very massive endeavor involving multiple actors. And with proper coordination, it gets easier for us to take decisive action to stop mass atrocities, not only in a timely manner, but in the most efficient manner, using our networks and resources.
Thank you so much. Our next question, and I'm afraid it's going to be our final question, as we just have 2 minutes left for the answer, is for Tom. Tom, in your opinion, what should be the criteria for a country to make a legitimate claim to the Arctic?
Well, the legitimate claims to the Arctic are those countries which surround it. I mean, the Arctic Ocean is surrounded by continents, countries. And the rest of the international system has rights, as they do, to be treated fairly and to be part of the trading system and to have transit rights and so on. But the Arctic policy should primarily be made by Arctic nations. And in Canada, it's not just this, I've been arguing, and the argument in our book is it's not just the state, it's not just Ottawa and Ottawa officials who should have a role in making that policy. It should also be the people who live there, particularly the people who've lived there for 10,000 years. So the Arctic, the primary actors in the Arctic should be those nations which surround the Arctic Ocean.
Thank you so much, Tom. And I want to thank everyone in our audience who participated and sent us such thoughtful questions. That was really helpful. And to thank all of our speakers today for their answers and for their time and sharing their expertise with us. I'd now like to pass over the virtual microphone to Tina to say a few closing remarks.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'd just like to take a moment to thank our partner, NATO Association of Canada, and Robert and Alex for all their hard work, as well as our fantastic panelists, all of whom are advisory board members at the Canadian Centre for R2P, for sharing their insights and time with us today. Please stay tuned and follow us on Twitter and Facebook for both CCRTP and NATO Association of Canada, because we have many more interesting events lined up for the rest of the year. And on behalf of both organizations, we wish you a happy Canada Day, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm glad the sound was fixed.